Good afternoon from Jakarta and hello to everyone joining from other parts of the world. We hope you're having a good day. Welcome to the 7th series of Global Town Hall on Balancing Interests, a North-South dialogue on trade protectionism. I am Morgan and I will be the master of ceremony for today's discussion. In addition to the annual flagship event, the Global Town Hall has now convened regular, small-scale discussions intended to create a platform for conversation among the civil societies. The theme of the discussions will range from geopolitics, climate, food security, technology, and many more. Please look forward to the upcoming Global Town Hall series. Today, I am pleased to welcome over 480 registered participants to this discussion. We have attendees from more than 35 countries to name some but not all: Algeria, Australia, Bulgaria, Brunei, Eswatini, Fiji, Ghana, Kuwait, Serbia, Mexico, Morocco, Turkey, Thailand, Mali, Croatia, Nigeria, Peru, India, and many more, making this an actual global town hall. Today's discussion will look into how trade protectionism has resurged as a significant factor influencing global markets. We have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Sun Lipeng, Assistant Director and Associate Research Professor at Institute of American Studies, China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Professor Simon Evanet, Academic Director of the MBA programs at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. Tom Lembong, Director of Consilient Policy Institute, former Head of Indonesia's Investment Coordinating Board, and former Minister of Trade of the Republic of Indonesia. Welcome, everyone. Now, without further ado, allow me to hand over the discussion to our moderator, Karim Kasim, Analyst at Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS, Malaysia. Mr. Karim, you may have the screen. Mr. Karim, if you could unmute your page, please.
Yes. I didn't see I didn't get the prompt for the unmute. Hello, hi, welcome to the Global Town Hall for the session today. I'm very pleased to hear that we have over 480 registered participants from over 35 countries. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled Balancing Interests, a North-South Dialogue on Trade Protectionism. My name is Karim from ISIS Malaysia and your moderator for this session. Today's discussion will touch on a topic that is not only very timely, but also vital as we navigate the complexities of the modern economy. In today's era, a resurgence of tariffs, non-tariff measures, and industrial policies has emerged. It's important to understand why trade protectionism, or in other words, policies adopted by nations to safeguard domestic industries from foreign competition, which have long been contentious in international economics, is becoming increasingly important in this new era of political economy. In recent years, we have seen a marked shift from purely economic considerations to a more strategic approach where economic policies and economic actions are being increasingly influenced by geopolitics. Major economies, notably the US and China, have been engaged in escalating tit-for-tat actions, profoundly impacting global supply chains and economic security. As the world becomes increasingly interconnected, understanding the dynamics of trade protectionism and its implications for international cooperation, economic growth, and global trade norms is becoming more crucial than ever. Today, our esteemed panel of experts is a diverse group of speakers who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience from various perspectives. They will help us unpack the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead as we strive for a more balanced and equitable global trading system. Now, without much further ado, let me introduce our distinguished guests. First, we have the very esteemed Mr. Thomas Lembong. Now, Tom is no stranger to trade policy as he served as the Indonesia's trade minister and chairman of Indonesia's Investment Coordinating Board, now renamed to Indonesia Ministry of Investment from 2015 to 2019, before serving in Jokowi's cabinet. Tom spent his illustrious career in finance, starting with the likes of Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank, where he then co-founded Kuvat Capital Partners in 2006, a private equity firm in Indonesia. He also had a stint in government from 1999 to 2000 as a senior vice president at the Indonesia Bank for Restructuring Agency to recapitalize and restructure Indonesia's banking sector after the 1998 financial crisis. Today, Tom heads the Consilience Policy Institute in Singapore and serves on the International Advisory Council of the Institute of International Strategic Studies in London. Next, hailing from the very scenic snow-capped Alps of Switzerland, we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Simon Evenet. Professor Simon is the academic director of the MBA program at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland, where he is professor of international trade and economic development. He is also program director of the International Trade and Regional Economics program at the Center of Economic Policy Research, the most established group of trade economists in Europe. Professor Evenet is well known as an expert in commercial policy and geo-economic great power strategies, publishing over 125 journal articles, as well as authored countless numbers of books. In fact, I had the pleasure of reading his most recent article in the East Asia Forum just today, just this morning, on supply chain disruptions. Okay, and last but certainly not least, we are honored to welcome Dr. Sun Lipeng. Dr. Sun currently serves as the Deputy Director and Associate Research Professor at the Institute of American Studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, a major Chinese think tank specializing on international strategic and security issues. Dr. Sun's primary research focus is on the US economy and US-Sino economic and trade relations. He is a well-published author in many academic journals and has co-authored dozens of books in China. Please welcome me and join in welcoming our esteemed panelists. Okay, we'll start the questions with Tom. Mr. Tom, during your time serving as Indonesia's trade minister, your focus had been to liberalize Indonesia's economy. Can you share with us what were the biggest challenges in achieving these goals? And can you describe the current state of trade protectionism in Indonesia? Over to you, sir.
Thanks so much, Kareem, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the FPCI for inviting me to participate in this great town hall today. So Indonesia, in many respects, has gone somewhat famously from being very progressive, right? Being very reformist and internationalist at the beginning of President Jokowi's first term to now being very interventionist, and to use the more traditional term, protectionist, during President Jokowi's second term. And of course, I served under his first term cabinet, and it was much more progressive, more internationalist. These days, we try to avoid the word liberal or even liberalizing, right? But the pivot from the internationalist approach, which was trying to open up the Indonesian economy to international investment, to international trade, integrating Indonesia with regional supply chains, in the first term, to again, to use a more traditional word, the protectionism that we've seen in President Jokowi's second term, like that U-turn has certainly been very, very jarring, right? For investors, for trade partners, for industry, and the like. I think personally, for me, it was remarkably easy to reform trade practices, trade policies in the first term. Both President Jokowi and Vice President Kala gave me the full support that I needed. Right, they threw sort of their full political weight behind my efforts to open up the Indonesian economy to enter into trade agreements with other countries and other trade blocs. It's really during the second term that shift occurred. Now, some might argue that President Jokowi's second term coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic and also with the outbreak of hostilities in Ukraine and more recently, of course, in Palestine. And some will also argue that the rise in protectionist policies in Indonesia is merely aligned with the same phenomenon in many other countries around the world, right? Some of that is true. Some of that is true. Certainly, many of the reasons or rationalizations given for some of our policies are such, right? The building greater resilience to the fragilities that were exposed in global supply chain by the COVID-19 pandemic, or, for example, trying to reduce, dependency on certain geopolitically complicated suppliers or technologies, right? But I think what I would point out is a couple of things, just to at the beginning of this conversation. Yeah. Number one, I like to urge people to move on from rather old-fashioned terms like protectionism or liberalization, right? And maybe use words like interventionist or distortive, right? Like distortive policies, or progressive and internationalist or reformist. I know, progressive internationalist reformist is not quite as efficient as liberalizing, right? But I think it's worth delving, more deeply into the nuances, because really, what protectionism is meant to convey, right? What it's meant to describe is a heavier state intervention into trade flows, into trade arrangements, right? So really, before we talk about protectionism versus liberalizing, right, or closed versus open, interventionist versus light touch, right? So the first question is: do governments want to be very hands-on? Do they want to be very interventionist? Do they want to really intervene, or do they want to be less interventionist, right? More in the old days we used to say laissez-faire, right? Kind of leave it more to the market, right? I think the fact that governments are inclined to intervene more heavily, that's across the board. That's a phenomenon we're seeing, around the world, and very few governments these days would say that, oh, we're just going to leave things to the market, right? Which is a dramatic change from 1990s or even the 2000s, an era probably too long ago for many young participants in today's town hall to remember, right? But there was a time when the consensus was, look, the market knows best, industry knows best, investors know best, let them decide, right? And the government sort of stepped back quite a lot. Partly because of the pandemic, partly because of the new Cold War between China and the US, partly because of other earth-shaking developments such as internet, now AI. I think governments all around the world want to be much more interventionist. They want to intervene. They want to be very hands-on. They want to, meddle in trade flows, in investment flows, and so on. But okay, let's then conclude. Okay, so state wants to be very involved, right? Wants to be much more controlling or exert much more influence over industry, trade, and investment, or maybe even tourism and digital. Then the next question is, are the governments actually exerting a positive influence? Are they actually implementing smart policy, right? Effective policy that shows very clear positive results that can be directly linked as being the product of those interventions, of those policy interventions, right? So, for example, it's very clear that the government of Singapore was very hands-on in negotiating an exclusive contract with Taylor Swift to hold, all her concerts in Southeast Asia only in Singapore and none in neighboring countries. So that's clearly state intervention, right? To the public displeasure of everyone from our president in Indonesia to understand, Philippine President Marcos has expressed displeasure, and Thai Prime Minister Srettha has expressed concern about how the Singapore government, intervened to secure or monopolize even Taylor Swift entirely for Singapore, right? But I think there was actually measurable positive impacts to Singapore GDP from, I forget what it was exactly, 4 or 5 or even 6 days worth of Taylor Swift concerts, right? So that's a smart, or arguably a smart, entrepreneurial, and clearly successful state intervention, right? The problem is that many times state intervention is irrational. It's often completely poorly designed policy, and in fact, ultimately has little to show for it. Right? You can't point to very concrete, quantifiable benefits from that intervention. If anything, you could potentially have a lot of complaints from a lot of people that this policy intervention actually creates so much difficulty, so much trouble, right? The second thing you have to be careful of is, whilst there might be quantifiable benefits, you have to monitor them over time. You can't just say, "Oh, gee, our exports went up dramatically," right? But the question is, number one, is it really because of those policies? Again, as I said, can they be clearly linked as being the product of those policies, or is it because of coincidence, right? Other factors were at work that caused your exports to boom, such as, for example, the skyrocketing prices of vegetable oils and fertilizers or wheat in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? And are those quantifiable benefits like rising exports sustainable over time, right? Let's be patient and not celebrate prematurely, but let's make sure that going into year 3, year 4, year 5, those exports remain strong, right? And that there's not other drawbacks or other things that are happening which actually can entirely offset those benefits. Lastly, what happens a lot, Kareem and esteemed audience and my esteemed fellow panelists today, a lot of times what we call protectionist policy or heavy-handed state intervention is driven by political desire or political need, right? It's often grandstanding, right? It's often more for symbolic purposes or for political purposes. And one risk that I would highlight is that a lot of governments who rely on this, right, rely on sensational policy like banning certain imports or banning certain exports, the way Indonesia famously banned exports of nickel, right, nickel ore and unprocessed nickel, right? Governments that rely on these kinds of sensational interventions oftentimes end up neglecting other policy areas or other policy needs, right, that are required for successful trade, successful investment, successful tourism, successful economic development. Let me give you one example, right? Indonesia has made its state intervention in the nickel mining, nickel processing sectors so prominent. It's become the centerpiece of our entire economic strategy. But in the meantime, our anti-money laundering agency claims that online gambling, like illegal online gambling in Indonesia, has led to a capital outflow of as much as $200 billion, right, over the last 2 or 3 years, which is probably equivalent to the entire, boost in our exports thanks to the nickel policy, right? And more recently, for example, our entire immigration IT system is down because hackers successfully penetrated our so-called kind of national data center, right, at the Ministry of Telecommunications and Technology, and it's now become public that it was a ransomware attack, right? The hackers are demanding something like $7 or $8 million of ransom before they unlock the entire national data center system that they've locked up through essentially encrypted, right, from our own government, and it's also subsequently been exposed that the government seems to have put insufficient attention on cybersecurity of our own systems, of the government systems. And so, one often underappreciated risk of the so-called protectionist policies or very heavy-handed, sensationalist, trade policies, but also other kind of economic policies, right? Is that they distract from things that you should actually be focusing on, right? Like, how do you expect to build a big and vibrant and successful digital economy if you cannot even protect your own government's digital infrastructure, right? Like immigration systems, banking systems, and the like. So let me stop there. But there's a few thoughts, kind of reviewing the last 10 years of Indonesia's evolving trade policy and the current state of affairs with our trade policy in Indonesia.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tom. I totally understand the issue of the Taylor Swift controversy. There was a lot of talk in Malaysia when that episode did happen. Why wasn't Malaysia more active in inviting Taylor Swift? And so many articles were written based on that. And I once dated a Taylor Swift fan myself, so no, I understand. I understand how passionate their fans can be. Thank you so much. Next, Professor Simon. Just a segue into what Tom mentioned about increasing sort of this interventionist approach. Looking at the recent tariffs by the US and the EU on Chinese electric vehicles, as well as the EU deforestation regulations and things of the carbon adjustment mechanisms, what does such phenomena say about the current state of global trade in developed economies? Are we heading into a more sort of a interventionist world? And what would you say would be the strategy of global South nations like Indonesia to downstream investments, especially from the developed world, in light of these new developments? Over to you, Prof.
So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak, and it is a good opportunity for me to reflect on the perhaps more global developments in light of what we've just heard about the interesting trajectory taken by Indonesia. I think I would summarize the developments since the global financial crisis a bit like this, and I will come to your questions because I think it's the final phase in what we've seen. Just so to provide sort of context for this, as you well know or may know, I have for the last 15 years run the Global Trade Alert Initiative, which tracks systematically what governments are doing around the world in the areas of trade and investment policy. And so we have been building essentially from official sources a picture of how trade policy developments are unfolding. And it's slightly different from the picture that you get if you read the newspapers, because I would argue in the first phase when we had the crisis response after the global financial crisis until the trade war, most of the actions taken by governments were very, very under the radar screen, often subsidies of different types. And quite frankly, governments were often, and I think they were intervening, to use the phrase which was described. They were increasingly distorting trade, and we actually saw a lot of this happening. But it was done in a way where I think everyone understood that they were moving at the margins, let's put it this way, of what is allowed under world trade laws. Let's just put it like that, if not outright cheating. Then we move into the next phase where, as Tom said, it became popular in some jurisdictions to be seen to be hitting other countries' trade. And of course, the leading example of this would be President Trump's trade war against China. But from time to time, we had low-level occurrences like this. So actions taken by Western nations against steel imports would be a classic example, typically occurring whenever the steel industry gets in trouble in Europe or North America, or in time for elections and things like this. So you had essentially, I think, over time, more and more salient trade policy where politicians are standing up, putting their hands up and saying, hey, look, we intend to hit our trading partners. And that's a new and, quite frankly, a worrying development which President Trump injected more into the system. Then we get to the third phase, which of course is the pandemic response. And here it's quite natural during this phase that there was indeed a lot of public policy intervention. The question really becomes whether it was particularly well designed and whether we had to distort trade and put in place export bans and things like this. It's very important to highlight that during the pandemic that there are a number of G20 members that did not put in place export bans on medical goods. And so the argument that these things are a necessity, you have to do this, is actually contradicted by the evidence if you look into it. And so again, I think there's something to learn from that third phase. And now we're sort of in this fourth and final phase where the fallout from the pandemic has led to questions about economic security and security of supply. There also have questions now, of course, associated with increasing geopolitical rivalry. And lastly, a sort of resurgence of interest in industrial policy. And this heady brew is really what faces the trading system as we speak. Now, many of the things that Tom said about the efficacy of these policies, I would endorse entirely. We started an initiative of tracking very closely industrial policy interventions at the beginning of last year called the New Industrial Policy Observatory, which we run with the IMF. And this has generated a lot of insights into what governments are doing. And here we have very few governments actually specifying what their objectives are in quantifiable terms in the areas of industrial policy and selective intervention, which of course is going to enable them to declare victory and declare it a success, whatever the outcome is. And of course, this is no guarantee of well-designed policy, and is unlikely to result in very well-designed policy or in attempts to learn about how to design policy better. So I think this current phase is one which is pretty alarming from a policy design point of view, and something where we could all do a hell of a lot better. And maybe in the questions and answers, we can talk a bit more about how to do that. Now, to get to your specific questions about Europe, with respect In Europe, we have another layer added on top of this, which is that in the European Union, of course, trade policy is one of the few exclusive competencies of the European Commission. And it's one of the areas where the member states essentially follow, or they delegate to the European Commission policy in this area. And as a result, it's one of the areas where a lot of special interest groups put huge pressure on the Commission, either directly or via the Parliament or through member states, to put in place legislation on things which on items they want to see fixed. And of course, because the trade instrument is seen as being so strong, lots of issues get freighted on trade. And the leading example we have, of course, is the deforestation initiative, where essentially the EU has moved from, instead of encouraging countries to develop excellent deforestation initiatives, they're moving to a much more punitive system where imports of 7 commodities are increasingly conditioned. Market access has been conditioned on certain behaviors or certain sourcing behavior. And so we can see here, this is one example of how interest groups have hijacked EU trade policy. And we are seeing this also in the area of corporate social responsibility, where there is an extremely far-reaching regulation which is going to come on force. Fortunately, it's only going to affect the largest companies, but still they will have very serious obligations put on them. And so essentially trade policy is being deployed to a whole series of social and other priorities. And to be frank, there's nothing wrong with some of those social priorities. When you think about deforestation or inappropriate using of forests or child labor or forced labor, you can have an argument about what the right policies are there. What I would certainly question is whether using the trade instrument is the right way to do this. But it is what it is, and this regulation is there. Now, in terms of the deforestation initiative, I think the European Commission has been surprised at the extent of pushback, not just from the countries in Southeast Asia, but also from Latin America, and now increasingly the United States as well has weighed in on this issue. And so I think there is going to be there will have to be a rethink as to how this policy is going to be executed. And I would watch to see who is appointed to the new trade commissioner, whether or not the new European Commission takes a step back and looks at a lot of the regulations that they've put in place in the last few years and wonder whether or not all of it should be implemented in the manner that it was originally intended. So I think there is a particular dynamic which is worth following very closely, and I'm sure, given the stakes in Southeast Asia in these questions, you will be doing this. So that's with respect to the deforestation regulations. Now, with respect to electric vehicles and the like, we do have, of course, here a very, very sort of high-profile set of measures which have been taken by the European Union, but also last month by the United States as well. And in both cases, you cannot help but feel that these are driven largely by election dynamics. And the timing of this, I think, was quite deliberate. It should also be said that for all the press attention given to the American measures, they only cover $18 billion of Chinese trade. And the European Union's measures, if the American measures are targeted, the European ones are surgical because they're much, much more forensic in terms of their application. They're unlikely to work in both cases, and Chinese EV producers are already investing heavily in Western Europe. In fact, some of the countries which are pushing for tariffs in Europe on Chinese EVs are also at the same time trying to encourage BYD and other firms to set up production facilities in their country. So there's almost incoherence in the policies being pursued there. But essentially, we have a number of election-driven measures being taken in this regard. And of course, it reflects the fact that when it comes to electric vehicles, the Chinese have done exceptionally well. Yes, they may well have had industrial policy, but the scale of the success goes well beyond the size of the subsidies which have been awarded. And some of these Chinese EV companies are very, very commercially successful. And by the standards of the people who compare cars, these are very, very good cars in many respects. So we are essentially punishing success. And of course, we're not just punishing success in an industry which has no environmental payoff. Here we're actually punishing success in sectors typically where there could be a very positive climate payoff. And this should trouble anyone who's concerned about climate change as well. So I think what we have, and by the way, there's I think one other important lesson there, which is that the climate imperative is extremely important, and we have to find a way to come together on this. But I think what we're learning is that no matter how important that imperative is, there are other factors which are driving trade policy at times like this, whether it is geopolitical rivalry, elections, and the like. And these will take us sometimes in directions which actually are counterproductive in terms of helping to transition to a cleaner energy economy. And so there's the classic tensions which often come in trade policy come to the fore very much in electric vehicles and in climate-related goods. And it does indeed speak to a number of the considerations that Tom pointed to, which is governments perhaps elevating trade policy solutions ahead of thinking about what the underlying problems are. And if one has a EV industry which is behind, then one might want to ask the question, why is that, rather than trying to block out firms and companies which have got their act together. So I think there's this point that Tom made about essentially bandwidth. When you allow trade policy instruments to take up all the bandwidth, then often governments stop thinking creatively about the supply sides of their economies and what it takes to help business people create successful competitive companies, which ought to be the industrial policy objective, not some of the objectives which are described typically these days. Thank you.
Oh, okay, good. Unmuted now. Thank you so much, Professor Simon. I think you're absolutely right. I think you and Tom hit the nail on the head. A lot of this is because of political posturing, and we must remind ourselves that it's an election year in Europe and in the US. Definitely, the timing could not have been any more opportunistic. Okay, and last but not least, we have Dr. Sun. Onto Dr. Sun. Now, you are an expert in studying the US-Sino trade rivalry. What is your view on current US-China trade tensions? What are the implications for the ASEAN region overall? And with the possibility of, and yes, it's an election year, of another Trump presidency coming November, what implication would this have on China's relationship with the global South? On to you, Dr. Sun.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you, everyone. And just Ms. Lemon and Professor Simon have an excellent speech. I learned a lot. And if we mention the China-US trade relations, I think up to now is a mixed picture. And as you know, China-US relations is the most important and complicated bilateral relations in the world. And in my opinion, in the past many years, and China-US economic and trade relations still play a positive role of stabilizing bilateral relations in China and the United States. If we look back to 4 years, Biden administration and the 4 years, and even the United States take some tough tariffs and implement some policies of so-called de-risk. And in 2023, China and the US bilateral goods and services trade reached about $630 billion US dollars. So it means that two countries' economic trade intertwined deeply, and I think trade tensions will not only harm the United States or China's benefit its spillover effect will harm the free trade world. So the past 4 years, I think the China-US trade relation is not good, but it's not so bad. From positive perspective, first, our president and President Biden meet at last year and reached some consensus of San Francisco, and they will try to get two countries to strengthen economic cooperation. Is the first one. The second one is that even there are many trade friction between our two countries, the executive economic team still keep a close communication. The second one. The third one is about, I can give a statistic about economic between China and the United States. Because now that about 77% of US companies who do business in China have no plans to withdraw from China. And they still want to do business here. This means that the China and the United States, no government-driven forces for economic cooperation remain strong. The fourth about, you mentioned that tariff issues, and recently USTR imposed 301 tariffs, new tariffs on China. So in my opinion, and in my prediction, I think, yes, China and US trade friction may be escalate again, but I don't think China and the US has another overall trade war. If China and US do it well, deal with it well, I think in the US election year, China and US economic and trade relations can still input positive factors to bilateral relations. But at the same time, I want to say that from another perspective, that China and US also have faced some challenges. First, it's about tariff. Even just as I mentioned that even China and US have no new trade war, but if we see the USTR's new tariff is very targeted and strategic, and focus on China's EV, battery, and solar panel. All this, I think, after pandemic, China's economic recovery has 3 or 4 driving forces, right? For example, EV, battery, and other products. But the United States no focus on these issues. It means that maybe the United States have some strategic consideration about China-US relations. The first one, the first challenge. The second challenge is about you mentioned that the Ukraine and the Russia conflict, right? Because the United States imposed sanctions on China because of Russia and the Ukraine conflict. If the United States sanctions Chinese bank, it will encounter China's some countermeasures. So unlike the traditional tariff war, and once China and the United States have friction in the financial field, I think the damage is unpredictable. It's my second view. The third view is about, 2021, the US and other West countries use excuse of debt trap to criticize China, right? And last year, they criticized China as a new excuse of economic coercion. This year, have a new excuse of overcapacity, right? So it means that the United States and like to joint hands with his economic allies to squeeze China's economic environment for economic development. This is third one. So in my opinion, I think the United States, no, I think the United States, in order to keep himself economic competitiveness, improve the supply chain security, and promote economic balanced development, he takes tariff have at least 3 characters. First is about trade protectionism. As you know, now the world economy is undergoing anemic growth, right? And regional conflicts harm the normal economic activities in the world. And the third factor about the trade tariff. So these factors overlapped. I think it's very, very bad news because it can harm the global aggregate demand, and regional countries, especially in Asia, Russia, other countries, export will face more difficult than before. So, but the most important thing is that the WTO rules now, I think, is less effective to restrain behavior of trade protectionism. It means other countries will do the same things. So I don't think it's a good news for the trade cooperation in the world. This is the first one. Second characters is about the United States now is using the weaponized economic interdependence, right? As you know, China's economy achieved a successful route in the past decades. But at the same time, I must acknowledge that in some economic field, China also depended on the US market, US technology, and the US even currency, right? So, but at the same time, the United States use this dependence, economic dependence, as a weapon to sanctions and threaten China. So at the same time, the United States also afraid that China's countermeasures will hurt it, and so they try to enhance his industry and increase his so-called supply chain resilience. I think the driving forces, the main reason is that about this, it's related to his weaponized economic interdependence. The third character is about U.S. politicizing the economic and the trade issues. Biden administration's economic policies on China is very clear. It's just to reshape the economic environment for China's development. For example, it joined hands with the G7 countries to strengthen export controls against China, curse other countries to take sides and remove China from the US-led industry chains. So this makes regional countries in a dilemma, right? If they chosen the United States, means that they lost more opportunities for economic and trade cooperations with China. So I think it may be will separate the trade world, the world trade system. Yeah. So, and I want to add some comments on the Professor Simon about China's EV policy. I like to just share 2 or 3 cases about this. First one, I just said that is since China joined the WTO in the maybe past 2 decades, and China's car trade import have increased from 1.6 billion US dollars to 62.4 billion US dollars, and 2023 maybe about 800,000 cars from the United States, European Union, and other countries enter the China's market. China never says that it's overcapacity, but as a driving forces of improving our competitiveness is the first one. The second one, I want to say that our capacity issues may be, it's often intertwined involved in subsidy issues, right? So I can give an example of that. Do you know that BYD is a very famous EV company in China? So in 2015, BYD, the E6 model in China's market, his selling price is just about 300,000 yuan, but one-fourth of the price is from China government's subsidies. I must confirm this. But 10 years ago, no, if you buy a new car in China's market, it's just about 150,000 yuan. And no, the subsidy is zero. And recently, our government provides some subsidies on EVs consumption, but it's just to stimulate our consumption, not to provide some another subsidies on the EV companies. It's a different concept, I think, and I think so. So this issues, I think, at the same time, the United States last year enacted the new laws of Inflation Reduction Act and provided huge subsidies for its EV cars, right? At the same time, Japanese company can get Inflation Reduction Act subsidies in the United States, but the Chinese companies can't. So at the same time, European Union also announced that will impose some new tariffs on China's EV, right? But actually, it takes no substantive countermeasures to the United States approach. So this is a new reality. And I also share status with you that is that European Union issue. I think up to now, everyone know that United States treats China as an economic competitor, right? And China is eager for stable relations with
Dr. Sun, could you give your final thoughts because I need to move on to the next question.
Okay. Yes. So my point, the key point is that China US should sit down and deeply negotiate these issues and find a way to strengthen cooperation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sun. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I think a US-China full-blown trade war would be disastrous for everybody. And I think we need to prevent this sort of occurrence from happening. Now, I would just like to officiate the Q&A fireside chat to all our participants joining us today from 35 different countries. Leanne, if you would please, just to officiate the Slido link in the chat, and then we can get people to post their questions. Yeah, state your name, where you're from, and who your question is addressed to. Yeah, okay. And just to kick things off, once the questions start coming in, I just want to shift a little bit to the topic of the Global South, just as a primer. And Mr. Tom, actually, I just wanted to start with you. With Indonesia being a growing middle power in the Global South, what do you see? How do you see Indonesia being affected either positively or adversely by escalating U.S. Sino protections? Especially for countries in the Global South, Malaysia as well we're also very well known to be in the Global South. How should countries like Indonesia and the rest of the developing world respond to the possibility of another Trump presidency? Mr. Tom.
Thank you, Karim. Um, well, um, I like to promote this concept we have in our organization and in our political movement centered on ex-Jakarta Governor Anies Baswedan, who just ran for president, right? Which we call values-based policy rather than transactional policy. Yeah. So concurrent with heavier state intervention are arguments by governments that they need to do this to protect their economies, protect local industry, promote investment, right? Promote economic growth and so on, right? But there's more to life than just economic growth or rising exports, right? In fact, if you look to the business sector, right, and Professor Simon, it's Sen Gallen might also chime in here, right? If you look at what drives business success lately, it's actually more around values, right? It's around values, around identity, like a brand identity, and what you stand for, what the consumer, how the consumer sees you, right? Like, do they like your brand? Like, do they trust your brand, right? Do they respect your brand? And so when we promote this concept of values-based policy, a policy that reflects our most deeply held values, such as a kind of humanism, right? That we put the human being at the center of all things. That we believe in the supremacy of human life, for example, right? Or what else are our values? For example, the notion that we as human beings have a moral responsibility to act as custodians for nature, right? To protect the environment and caretake nature, right? Those are sort of values that should drive our economic policy, including our trade policy, actually. Now, I believe the Europeans would partly, at least, lean on that argument as well, right? Like, look, the anti-deforestation law is meant to conserve nature and combat climate change, right? This is not only in our own self-interest as human beings, right? We wanna solve the climate crisis, but also makes sense from a moral perspective, right? Like, in addition to the anti-deforestation law, the European Union also recently just narrowly passed another law mandating larger conservation of nature areas across the continent, right? But back to my point earlier, how does one navigate the superpower conflict between Washington and Beijing as a middle power, right? As sort of the countries in between, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the like. Certainly, I believe my team and my political boss, right, ex-Jakarta governor and recent presidential candidate Anies Baswedan, believe that the best way is, as much as possible, to adhere to principles-based and values-based policy. And I like to tell people, in doing so, I personally estimate we would agree with Washington 70% of the time, but disagree with Washington about 30% of the time. We'd also agree with Beijing 70% of the time, but we'll disagree with Beijing 30% of the time. But number one, we'll be more consistent, right? Because we'll be driven by a consistent set of values, a consistent set of principles. And secondly, hopefully it would de-escalate, depoliticize the policy dialogue, right? Because both Washington and Beijing would be able to understand and respect that our policy positions are not driven by, like or dislike or pro or anti, by partisanship, but by values which in many cases, or maybe I would say in most cases, we share in common with Beijing and Washington, right? As Professor Simon pointed out, the climate crisis affects all of us, not equally, but it does affect all of us devastatingly to varying degrees. It's something that definitely is a common interest, right? Same with public health challenges, where there's a rise of non-infectious diseases, so-called lifestyle diseases like rising obesity, rising high blood pressure or diabetes, right? Obesity is now rising fastest in the developing countries, by the way, right? And it's actually possible to have both malnutrition and obesity at the same time, right? You might be lacking essential nutrients, right? You might be poorly nourished whilst, ingesting or consuming way too many calories, making yourself, quite obese and causing yourself a lot of health problems. So we really believe in this values-driven, values-oriented approach to policy, whether it's trade policy, economic policy, and foreign policy.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Mr. Tom. I absolutely agree with you on the basis of human-based economy and human-based policies. I think in Malaysia, our current government, under the Madani economic framework, this is verbatim what Prime Minister Anwar is seeking to do as well. Yeah. Okay, I think there are a few people who are a bit confused with with the Slido questions. I think I have one question here, and this question is addressed to Tom. With Indonesia's new incoming administration, with Indonesia's new incoming administration, do you foresee a rise in protectionist sentiment, or do you think liberalization is still on the agenda? Perhaps I can ask the audience if they cannot access the Slido to perhaps post your questions in the chat box, if that's possible.
Yeah, thank you. So President-elect Prabowo and Vice President-elect Gibran obviously campaigned on a platform of policy continuity, right? They vow to continue all of current President Jokowi's policies. And so we should assume that that also includes the more interventionist, the more distortive, and the more transactional kinds of policies we saw from President Jokowi in the second term. Yeah. I think it'll be interesting to see the extent to which markets allow the incoming administration to continue those policies, right? I would argue, together with my political camp, admittedly, that the current policy trajectory is causing too many problems, right? And it's actually leading to reduced economic resilience, reduced resilience to supply chain shocks and the like. But again, they are the constitutionally elected incoming administration, so they will number one be held accountable for delivering on their campaign promises, and number two, they will need to deal with the markets here on kind of the consequences of the policies that they're seeking to continue.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Tom, Mr. Tom. Okay, I think I don't see any new questions, but okay, and this is why I have a few questions in my bag as well. I think we should also get Professor Simon's opinion on this as well. Professor Simon, okay, so thanks so much for your insightful discussion earlier. I would just like to ask a little bit about the relations between global North and global South countries, whereby for the longest time since economic history started in Southeast Asia, modern economic history, I would say, Southeast Asia has been on the receiving end of a lot of the investments and a lot of the supply chain diversification from the global North, developed nations, and what have you. With this growing trend of, I'm sure you've heard reshoring, friendshoring, onshoring. It's a very big part of what Dr. Sun mentioned of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. What does this imply for the global South moving forward? Do you think this push for supply chain diversification, as they would call it, would actually make supply chains more resilient? What's your take on this?
So thank you for the opportunity to address this really important question, because there is indeed a narrative about reshoring and alike, but I'm a bit of an empirical guy, so I like to look at the numbers before I endorse any particular narrative. And I went into the latest sort of global statistics on FDI, say, into Indonesia, and FDI into Indonesia has been in the 20 to 25 billion a year inflow range since 2017. I see no repatriation of funds or things moving away from Indonesia. If anything, the flow inward has been fairly constant. And I could say the same about many other of the big players in what you call the global South. So I think when I see numbers like that, I get a little bit nervous. I should also tell you that I'm also the co-chairman of the World Economic Forum's Trade and Investment Council, and we did a whole series of interviews with international corporations last year, and we asked them, are you reshoring? And there's a very interesting divide. If you talk to North American companies, they will say that they're under pressure from their customers to do this. But no other group of multinationals that we spoke to in other parts of the world said the same thing. Now, we are beginning to see a little bit of a data on the European side about possible intentions to either reshore or move some production out of places like China, for example. But again, not much has actually happened. So I would caution on this narrative almost becoming self-fulfilling. Even in the North American context, it's worth noting that while some US scholars are talking about what they call the great reallocation of factories, in fact, when people looked at the numbers for Canadian firms are not shifting their sourcing decisions at all. So again, even within North America, it does not appear to be a consistent pattern. So I think this is one of these areas where the narrative has got quite far ahead of the facts. Now, I should say that in the next 1 or 2 weeks, the United States will publish its inflow of foreign direct investment data for last year. And this will be very interesting because it'll show whether or not that we see a lot of foreign companies setting up in the United States in the sectors where the Inflation Reduction Act was operative. Last July's report showed very little uptake by European firms, a bit more by Japanese and Korean firms, but not much more out of that. So I think let's follow the data on this. Now, there is one area where I do think the data is pretty unmistakably clear, which is, and this is where we have a big difference from the Cold War era. During the Cold War era, the non-aligned countries, of which I believe Indonesia was one of them, these were countries which were significant in terms of population, but not so much in terms of economic weight. This time around, I think with the rivalry between certain large players, we have a large, I think quite a large non-aligned movement of emerging markets, which you call perhaps the global South, which have quite a lot of economic heft, much more economic heft than in the past. And again, when we spoke to these multinational executives from different parts of the world, I think these non-aligned countries are going to get a lot of attention as places where they're a little bit far away from the geopolitical points of tension. They may have underserved market segments, where customers could be better addressed by cross-border trade or possibly local production as well. So I think in many ways, this new phase of geopolitical rivalry will be quite different from the old one, where we have what you call a global south having a lot more heft, collective heft. Now, how that heft is deployed, we will see whether countries go on their own way or work together in groups and regions. We will see about this. But it is a fundamentally new era, and it's one where I think the larger emerging markets like Indonesia and others will be very well placed.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Simon. Okay, so we have a couple of questions in the chat box. This question is from Gusti Putu from Indonesia. So the question is addressed to Professor Simon and Mr. Tom. This is regarding of the European Union recently banned Indonesia and Malaysia crude palm oil due to a lack of commitment of the two countries to nature conservation and relatively high deforestation. So the question is, what additional leverage gained by the EU to implement this policy, I believe, what additional leverage is gained by the EU that they had to implement such a policy, and what should Indonesia's government do to respond to this EU decision besides taking the matter to the World Trade Organization? Perhaps, Tom, we start with yourself, and then Professor Simon as well. You can touch on, since you are from the very scenic snow-capped Alps of Switzerland. Well, we'd like to have your view as well. Tom?
Thank you, Karim. So building on my earlier comments, right? Conceptually, the Indonesian government has roughly 2 ways to respond to the EU policy, right? One is combatively and transactionally. Again, looking at it more from the lens of, okay, how many billions of dollars of our exports does this threaten? And how could we retaliate, or how could we mitigate the negative impact, or what economic policies or trade policies could we shape around protecting our interests, right? Or as I indicated earlier, you could take a values-based approach, and this would be a great illustration, right? Where you'd sort of say, well, let's be transparent and get the real data, and maybe as Professor Simon said earlier, right? He's a very empirical kind of person. Can we be transparent with real data from credible but neutral, independent third parties on the extent of deforestation, for example, right? So they were all at least talking from the same data set, right? Rather than making claims and counterclaims. And then, you could start from a position of common ground, right? Would anybody disagree that forests are valuable and should be protected, right? I don't think anybody would disagree. I think we would all agree that we want to combat deforestation. We all would agree that we should do more to conserve nature, to return nature to its closer to original state, closer to its original state. So conservation is a positive. That should be uncontroversial and should be common grounds for discussion, right? And ultimately, rather than combatively and transactionally, right? Like, okay, what can I offer in return, or what could I take away from you in retaliation, right? A collaborative approach where, okay, what can we do together, right? What can we do together to make you comfortable, right? To make you satisfied that we are doing what you think we should be doing, which again, this is where the issue of common ground comes in, right? We need to ensure that what you want us to do is also what we want us to do, frankly. right? Which I think there should be a lot of overlap when it comes to issues such as nature conservation, avoiding or combating deforestation and the like, right? So no medals, no awards for guessing which approach I would choose, right? Of course, I would choose the collaborative and values-based approach where we sit down together and then try to agree a series of milestones and then common goals that then address the issue that appears to be at the core of this penalties, if you will, right?
Thank you so much. Professor Simon, would you like to quickly respond to the question on EU restrictions on palm oil from Indonesia? And then there's another question for Dr. Sun, and then perhaps we'll have time for one last question, and then we'll conclude the session. Professor Simon, on to you.
Look, I'm broadly in line with Tom's approach here, and by the way, you should know that about 20 years ago, I had to investigate for the European Commission. I was commissioned to find out cases where these collaborative approaches were adopted, and they were not just interested in looking at European examples, but where had the Americans collaborated with countries in order to help raise labor standards or environmental standards. And there are great examples there where this type of collaborative approach makes a lot of sense. And again, if there is alignment on goals, on information availability, so we're not fighting over things like this, that would be a good place to start. But of course, I think one question one has to ask is, in the interim, whilst the countries of Southeast Asia are in raising their standards, what would be the market access that would be allowed? And if there was a reluctance on the European side to allow previous levels of market access, then one might have to think about whether or not CPO exports from Southeast Asia get directed to other markets, in which case the Europeans have a permanent reduction in their leverage, I would argue as well. So I would round out I would agree with his starting point and his conclusion, and then I think add this additional point here is that in some sense, the Europeans may have felt that they have a lot of leverage, but like in all trade sanctions or trade measures, the moment you start restricting trade, you're also reducing your own leverage. And that's, again, takes you back to why starting off with a more collaborative approach makes a lot more sense.
Thank you very much. Yes, I absolutely agree with what both Tom and Professor Simon has said. I think Malaysia as well, we're sort of in the crosshairs, in the same proverbial boat, as you will, on the CPO sanctions. Dr. Sun, so there is a question for yourself as well. With China being the target of tariffs from both the US and Europe, how would this shape public opinion, Chinese public opinion, on their attitude towards global trade? I think it's a very interesting question. On to you, Dr. Sun.
Thank you. On these questions, I think that China's public opinion is still welcome free trade and try to still take our painstaking efforts to reform the opinion up. As you know that recently, since pandemic, I think China's economy even now face some problems and difficulties, and as this background, I think China now, because China try his best to stimulate our economic recovery. In the past many years, we just depended on export, right? And this year, we try to depend more on investment and consumption, and we have new economic policies of improve our new quality forces productivity. So it's a very important thing that we must try to open our market and continue to improve our domestic business environment, absorb a lot of FDI around the world into China's market, and find this as a driving forces to stimulate our economic recovery. So in China, I think public opinion now is still welcome this the other country the free trade and the market opinion. I think this is the first one, and the second one that I must emphasize now, since the pandemic and the United States and other countries, West countries impose tariff on China, China's supply chain's pattern is undergoing fundamental change in the past many years. We import materials and components from Asian countries and region countries, and then assembling in China, and then export to the European Union, to the United States. But now, China is just this, and we try to invest more on the Asian countries, and then it re-export to the United States and the European Union. So China is trying his best to promote the regional economic integration. Everyone know free trade is very, very important for China. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Sun. Indeed, I think Chinese supply chains in the global system are unmatched. I think out of what you just mentioned, I think that point is made abundantly clear. Okay, I think so. It's 5:30. I think we have time, perhaps for one last question, and then we'll have some concluding remarks. And this question is from Salma from Indonesia, and it's also addressed to Mr. Tom. You're very popular today, Mr. Tom. Salma's question is, I'm a small business owner in a creative industry, and I'm worried about current regulations. Considering that we cannot always rely on the government, what can I do? What can I do as a small business owner to secure my business and survive in these trying times? Thank you. Mr. Tom, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Kareem, and thank you for the question. I guess it was not mentioned specifically which segment of the creative economy our colleague or friend is active in, or where she has her business. Could be graphic design, could be music, could be video editing, or other filmmaking, film editing. But that gives us an opportunity to highlight another important reality about modern trade, right? Is that digitalization and the internet is really opening up a whole new world of trade opportunity and investment opportunity, as well as financial opportunity. Now, I know it may seem a bit bold, right, to suggest that a small business in Indonesia could tap the international market. But I would encourage our small business owners, especially in the creative economy, right, the creative industries, to really look at global markets, at export markets, places like Australia, North America, right, Canada, USA, UK, Europe, and you'd be surprised. There's actually a lot of platforms, like online platforms. I remember there was one called freelancer.com in Australia, where it's like a marketplace for digital services. So, for example, clients in the advanced economies would then outsource or subcontract work like graphic design, illustration, architectural renderings, video animations or video special effects to freelancers around the world, mostly in developing countries, where workers can offer very competitive prices. And so, particularly for the creative economy, right? Because the creative arts or the creative products and services, whether visual or music or otherwise, are arguably the most easily digitized and sent through the internet, rather than having to navigate, seaports, customs, logistics, and many other onerous regulations, right? You deal directly with customers in the advanced countries who can offer very attractive revenues, very attractive, can be very attractive customers, right? Pricing wise, and I do believe that the talent in the developing countries is very good. Quality is very, very good, and at the same time we have a much lower cost base, right? We're able to offer much better prices than the same creative economy small businesses or entrepreneurs in the advanced economies.
Thank you so much. I think those are some very good words of wisdom for small business owners. Don't look insularly, look globally. Think big, think global. Absolutely. And thank you all to the participants for all your questions. We're actually a little bit ahead of time. We're actually a little bit behind time. So I'm so sorry to my sincerest apologies to the participants whose questions we don't have the time to go over. But I just want to conclude this session, perhaps with a bit of a concluding and final thoughts and final remarks to this question. Looking more into the future, what do you see in the free trade landscape in both the global South and developed economies, with an eye to the future? What do you foresee is the future landscape? Perhaps Dr. Sun, I'll start with yourself, and then Professor Simon, and last we'll end with Mr. Tom. Dr. Sun, over to you.
Okay, thank you, moderator. On this question, I think I have one view and four advices. First, I must emphasize that many developed countries no longer emphasize that now is free trade, right? But the so-called fair trade, economic resilience, myriad high-fence, national security concerns. So protection measures in the global north have become increasingly common because of the rapid economic development in the global south. So economic relations of big power are undergoing a fundamental change. So the big power competition, regional conflicts, and the adjustment of supply chains now is impacting the global trade development. So in my judgment, that the past of global free trade has no longer to return. It's my first views. On this background, I think China, global north, global south should join hands to strengthen economic cooperation. First, I think the very important thing is that the major economic power need to manage economic competition and keep exploring areas where we can cooperate. Stable relations between major countries can inject positive factors into the healthy development of trade, right? And the second is about developed countries and the developing countries should cooperate, make the WTO play a bigger role in multilateral trade cooperation, fully restart its dispute settlement mechanism. I think this could make it better to restrain members countries from protectionism. And I think each country should settle the trade dispute through negotiation and avoid tit-for-tat trade wars or mutual retaliation. I think this is very important. The third is about China is willing to strengthen cooperation with the global North countries, other global North countries, and jointly invest more on infrastructure and improve the local economic efficiency and create more opportunities for employment and gradually expand the big market of the global south. I think that this is very important, and realize more trade circulation within the global north market. I think this one. The last advice is about I must emphasize that one world, one trade system is very, very important. So the global south is eager for development. Yeah, and our goal, the final goal, and the ultimate goal is to raise people's living standards, not to challenge or replace the dominance of the big power. So the global north should also separate trade issues from political issues and security issues and take more friendly trade policies. I think it is very important. It's also the fundamental interest of all the people of all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sun. I think what you said is brilliant. One world, one trade system. Absolutely agree with that, sir. Okay, Professor Simon, do you have any concluding remarks on what do you foresee the free trade landscape in the global south and in developed economies? Over to you, sir.
Thank you for this opportunity to participate today. I think my concluding remark would be to say, look, the world trading system is in the future will be whatever we want it to be, whatever we make it, and that's very important because we do have agency. We saw overnight how suspicion and fears can drive rhetoric and politics, and I think the technocratic alternative, which is grounded in trying to identify areas of mutual interest, shared values, trying to resolve issues based on high quality information and data, letting the logic take as much role in these deliberations as possible. These are the ways in which we should try and resolve new problems and identify opportunities for the future, of which Tom's mention of cross-border delivery of services is one very, very important example. So I think my advice to everyone would be, let's double down on the technocratic approach. Let's try and ground as much of what we talk about in high quality evidence and facts. Let's improve our information diets and screen out some of the suspicions which are generated by people who want to divide us. And then we will get a trading system which will continue to support growth of living standards, which Southeast Asia and East Asia in general has benefited so much from. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Facts-based trade policy. Unite, do not divide. I love it. Thank you. And last but not least, Tom, would you like to give your concluding remarks on the future of the global trade ecosystem? Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. What I would say is I'm both optimistic as well as cautious on the short-term, medium-term, and long-term future for global trade, right? I'm optimistic because I sincerely believe that global trade is not only continuing, it's growing, just in a different shape than what we're accustomed to. I think politicians like to be very focused on trade in goods, or what we call merchandise trade, right? So, physical products. But as we already discussed during the session, arguably the biggest opportunity now in a digitalizing world and in a internet-driven world will be trade over the internet. Trade in digital goods, digital services, anything that can be digitalized, right? And as trade officials, we often don't include data flows in our metrics, in our sort of KPI or in our measurements, right? Yes, we do measure trade in services, but even trade in services tends to be much neglected in favor of, sensational policies around trade in goods, right? Metals, factory goods, consumer goods, right? Things that are like physical goods that are shipped around. Now, this next era of globalization and trade brings opportunity and peril, right? Risks. I already referenced earlier the devastating hacker attack on our national data center, right? Paralyzing our immigration service IT system. And so, cybersecurity issues become more important. As one example. But yeah, frankly, the other thing that's going to become more and more important, right? And I touched on this earlier, is trust, reputation, credibility, both for your customers around the world, right? For your customers to trust you, for your investors to trust you, for your own citizens to trust you, and that requires, one, as Professor Simon said, rational, sensible policy, right? That engenders trust, that generates trust. Number two, sincere intentions, which is again at the risk of repeating, right? Where our values-based policy comes in, right? If we can find areas of agreement, whether it's with Beijing or with Washington or each other, right, around the world, then we have less reason to be suspicious of each other, and hopefully that facilitates trade, tourism, and investment and exchange. And lastly, I would say just a reminder that the world always moves in cycles, and politics moves in cycles, and policy moves in cycles. The pendulum always swings, from one extreme to the other. So whilst we might be in a period of rising state intervention, don't be surprised. Suddenly, a few years from now, we wake up in a period of governments in retreat, right? Governments returning power to the private sector or to the markets. These things always go in cycles. And again, especially as the costs pile up, right? Especially as the negative impacts start hitting your voters, your citizens, then the politicians oftentimes have no choice but to return to reasonable policy or to rational policy, right? Yeah, for example, Chinese solar panels and Chinese wind turbine components and Chinese lithium-ion batteries, right? I would argue the urgency of the climate crisis is greater than the national security risks posed by sizable supply of Chinese solar panels, Chinese wind turbine components, Chinese lithium-ion batteries, right? Energy storage systems. And surely there are more effective and more targeted policies to more narrowly address the social security aspect of such products, right? To the extent that there are such concerns, rather than just blanket ban or blanket tariffs or blanket, very heavy-handed across-the-board intervention, which frankly could be a lose-lose, right? Like frankly, renewable energy actually makes a country more resilient, more energy resilient, more energy self-sufficient, and that's good for national security, right? So whereas, okay, what are you worried about? Are you worried that Chinese solar panels come embedded with hidden cameras or with hidden microphones or hidden sensors or hidden transmitters, right? There are actually engineering solutions to, ascertain or to assure that such quote unquote threats, right, are dealt with without having to in a way shoot yourself in the foot, as Americans like to say, right? Like you're trying to address one supposed threat, but in the process you're cutting off your own leg, right? You're actually making yourself more dependent on energy imports. You're making yourself less energy resilient by resisting Chinese solar panels or Chinese batteries or Chinese wind turbine components. Just to end with a concrete example, yeah. But yeah, and trust me, as the costs come home to voters and citizens, the politics will adjust. Will swing back in a more reasonable direction, I think.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tom. I absolutely enjoyed that you gave a very interesting Churchian analysis or Hegelian type analysis of policy and society works in cycles. I absolutely agree with that. Absolutely. I think that we have covered quite a lot today. Thank you once again to all our esteemed panelists. And let's work to build trust in our global trading systems. And I hope all the panelists gained some insight from our great discussion today. And thank you all once again for participating. I've been your moderator, Karim from ISIS Malaysia. And I wish you all a very good weekend. Terima kasih semua. 谢谢, 再见, Dankeschön, and merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Karim, for moderating this discussion, and also to Dr. Sun Li Peng, Professor Simon, and Bapak Tom for sharing your incredible insights. Before we wrap up the event, I would like to invite the speakers and participants for a short photo session. So if everyone could please turn on your cameras and have your brightest smile ready. So just get those cameras on, and on my count, in 1, 2, 3. And thank you, everyone. It has been a fruitful discussion, and I'm sure the participants have found the session interesting and highly informative. Today's event will be available for rewatch on FPCI's official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. Additionally, you will see a link in the chat box for everyone to fill in and claim the e-certificates. Please make sure to fill in the details correctly, as the e-certificates will be sent to your email. And before we officially close this event, I would like to announce that the Global Town Hall is back again this year. So join us on Saturday, the 7th of September, 2024, and be part of the North, South, East, West dialogue discussing the most pressing issues around the world. So stay tuned at gth2024.com and on our Instagram at Global Town Hall. See you at the next FECI event, guys. Bye.